Hey guys, welcome back to part two of the PIDTIR's financing discussion with Tim Green of Coates Rose. If you didn't hear part one of the PIDTIR's financing podcast, go back to the link that's shown in the podcast to get a basics of the PIDTIRs. And we hope you enjoy part two, where we really get into discussing the financial ramifications of using the PID and the TIRS combination. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you. So now that we've found a project, we've got a developer, we've run our numbers, we understand what the city and county are going to contribute as it relates to the TIRS. We've looked at our competitive tax rate equivalent vis-a-vis the competition. We're ready to go in and issue a bond with a PID and a TIRS combination. What is the process related to that, Tim, and how does the TIRS revenue ultimately then flow into the PID transaction? And I know that's a loaded question, but if you want to take a stab at it, and then I'll just ask some more clarifying questions as we go through it.
Well, what we start out with is we create the PID and the TIRS typically simultaneously. As part of creating the TIRS has to, or the city has to have a project and finance plan. And typically that project and finance plan will mirror the items that the city is going to fund through the PID, although it can certainly be broader. And then as part of that project and finance plan, the city will reach out to the county, for example, and seek their participation. And so that project and finance plan will probably will anticipate the county's participation. And then in conjunction with them adopting the project and finance plan, they'll do an interlocal agreement between the city and the county, where the county comes in and says, yes, I will participate in the TIRS to this extent. So now you have a TIRS created, you have a project and finance plan that is somewhat coterminous with the PID financing plan. And then you have the agreement of the county to contribute their money. And then you have the city's commitment as part of creating the TIRS to commit their money. So now you know you've got the PID in place. You know what your TIRS contribution is going to be. And then the next step when you go forward to develop is come up with your phasing of your development and the infrastructure that you want to fund. And then you put in place a service and assessment plan for that phase, or that phase in conjunction with future phases. And then based on that, you come up with the overlapping taxes that are going to be on the property, the amount of the assessment, the additional assessment that can be levied. And when you calculate out the amount of the additional assessment, you take into consideration the fact that the city and the county are going to contribute some percentage of their tax collections on the property, so that you can increase the amount of the assessment to reflect that cash flow that's going to come from the city and the county. So you end up with a PID in place, a TIRS over the top of it, a project and finance plan that reflects the city and the county's commitment to contribute part of their tax revenues. And then you have a service and assessment plan that is going to fund the improvements that were contemplated, and then a calculation of the assessments based upon the additional assessment that can be levied plus the cash flow from the TIRS.
For our listeners, if you go to the handout that's part of the show notes, you'll see exactly what Tim is talking about. And just to put it in terms of the numbers on the handout, if in our example we had assumed that we would be issuing PID bonds with a debt service additional tax rate equivalent of 34 cents. And as a result of that, in our example, we were issuing a total bond over time of $14.3 million. And with the TIRS subsidy, and in our example, we are showing that we're going to have 15 cents, which may be below what you typically see in Texas, but what we're using in our example, coming in to pay down the tax rate equivalent debt service tax rate, which in this case, because we're getting 15 cents coming in from the TIRS, we're able to increase it from what was 34 cents to 49 cents. And as a result of that, rather than issuing a $14.3 million bond over time, in this instance, we're able to issue bonds totaling $20.5 million for a difference of $6.2 million. And that's, what the real benefit of the PID-TIRS combination is that, we're able to issue larger bond amounts because at the end of the day, the TIRS is going to, in essence, help subsidize the bond payments of the homeowners or the assessment payments of the homeowners.
Yeah, I would say based on the typical scenario, you're typically, by bringing the TIRS into play, you're probably increasing the amount of financing that you can do through the PID. I'm just going to throw my hat down and say by 40%. So it is well worth the time, the effort, the energy, and the brain damage to get the TIRS put in place and get participation from the city and or the county.
Yeah, especially with, the cities and jurisdictions wanting gold-plated infrastructure or sticking, asking for a 10% contribution, or just, with the challenges we're having with labor and materials, that additional 40%, it really comes in handy to help deliver that infrastructure that's required for the project. Because the tax increment may not hit the rolls, there may be a time differential from the time when the assessment lien is laid down and when that annual assessment payment is required, Tim, and when the additional property tax revenue is brought in. What is the impact to the homeowner? Say I buy the first house and I have an assessment on my property, but the county appraisal district hasn't picked up the fact that I've got a completed home, and that tax revenue through the TIRS is not being collected. Does the builder step in, or do I have to pay it? Who pays that difference in the increment that we were anticipating coming in when we were sizing the bonds?
That's a good question, because that's what commonly happens. Is you set the amount of PID bonds that are sold, and therefore the debt service is based on over 30 years the TIRS revenue being available. But for the first couple of years, as the lot comes on, as the house comes on, it is very common for the TIRS revenue to lag behind those assessments. And so that's a problem that either the developer is going to have to absorb, the builder is going to have to absorb, or the home buyer is going to have to absorb in the beginning. But it's going to fall to the person who happens to own the lot or the house or the commercial property January 1 of each year, as the subdivision is developed and as it is built out, whether it's residential or commercial, and kind of gears up to being on the tax rolls for its full fair market value. But that is something that is normally disclosed to the builder, disclosed to the home buyer, understood up front. It's part and parcel to whoever's qualifying for any kind of a loan. and is just part of the typical business.
Yep. And that's important point that I'd like to make to the listeners, that this is disclosed. It's in the SAP. We tell the home buyers, builders that you are going to be paying the assessment at the maximum tax rate equivalent, and the TERS may or may not be available to help subsidize that payment. But be advised that this is the number without the TERS. And so everybody is well aware of that, and they all acknowledge that during their purchase process. Let me do another spin. So what if I start looking at that income stream and go, you know what? I would really like to have that TERS revenue just come into my cash flow stream as a developer. I don't want to use it to subsidize the PID, and I just want to clip coupons over 40 years. Can I do that?
Yes, you can make the decision if you're negotiating with the city, and you look at the amount of revenue that can be generated from the assessment, and then the amount of revenue that can be generated through the TERS. You can, as long as the city and the other any other entity that's participating is agreeable, you can use all or part of that TERS revenue to either subsidize the PID bonds, and if you don't want to use all of it, then you can take the other part of it, and you can either, the city or the county can legally use that to either fund other infrastructure that you may be building that's not directly benefiting the land in the PID, or they can use it as a pure economic incentive to the developer to incentivize him, so that they could literally take that 30-year cash flow, or it could be 40-year cash flow, and or cash flow through the life of the TERS, and they could pay that to you as an incentive. And so somebody could literally have that as, sometimes they describe it as their mailbox money.
Yeah, it would be nice mailbox money, but given the size of some of these projects. Now, do we have to prove up that we have expended money for TERS eligible improvements, or does that mailbox money just keep on coming as long as their tax increment and our TERS period has not run out?
Well, the TERS, again, a city through the TERS, they can use that money to fund infrastructure, and they have the legal right to use it just as an economic incentive.
Mm-hmm.
So most commonly, they will tie it to some infrastructure. But if they are looking to just drive the development, incentivize the development, which is fairly common with a mixed commercial and residential and commercial development, they can literally just say, this amount of money over X that's being used to fund infrastructure is just an economic incentive to the developer to get that property developed.
In which case, the developer would just collect the money and would not have to prove up their costs, and because that's quote unquote an incentive.
That is correct. He just has to do the development. However he funds it, mm-hmm. And then that's the money he gets as an incentive to help offset whatever costs he may incur out of his own pocket.
Yeah. And then I guess to the listeners, it really depends on, is your business plan one in which you want increased internal rates of return, in which case you may want to take the TERS as a subsidy to the bonds in order to accelerate cash into your pro forma by doing bigger bond deals. Or if you're nominal dollar, meaning you just want the largest reimbursement coming back to you over time through a combination of PID and TERS bond or TERS revenues, and you're not interested in the time value of money, then you may want to look at this scenario, just collecting the TERS as an economic incentive over time.
Or you can use it as a tool when you're negotiating with a commercial retail customer, whether it's a purchaser or a tenant, if you see that they're going to be generating a significant amount of sales tax revenue, for example, or ad valorem tax revenue, and you know that that's going to drive an economic incentive to you, you can kind of offset that revenue against what it takes to negotiate the deal with your customer.
Yeah, great idea. Great idea. And one question I forgot to ask you, Tim, when it comes to percentages of property tax increment versus sales tax increment, are those usually, in your experience, the same, or are they different different percentages?
My experience is they're usually what the city will do is say, come in and give me the projections on your ad valorem tax growth, residential versus commercial, and then they'll say, give me your projections of your sales tax growth, and then you negotiate the city's participation through the TERS separately. Those, in my experience, those are, they're looked at separately, although I'm sure they're part of the same over total package.
Yep, yep. And as we sit here today, are there any trends that you're seeing related to the use of the PIDTIRs to generate economic development within communities? Anything that our listeners should be aware of, Tim, that you're seeing that you'd like to share with everyone?
I think we've talked about a lot of them. Again, I think as the PID industry is maturing, you're starting to see more participation or more use of the PIDs by the cities. And as part and parcel to that, there typically has to be some participation through the TERS. And that's because they're either incentivizing the land that's in the ETJ to come into the city, or simply because the land in the city is so heavily burdened by taxes already that in order to be able to develop it, they've got to contribute something through the TERS. So we're seeing more and more PID TERSs. And then we have seen some where the city and the county are both participating more and more. And then I'm starting to see more where they participate through the ad valorem increment, and then the sales tax, or the ad valorem increment on the residential, the ad valorem increment on the commercial, and then the sales tax revenue, and they're negotiating different percentages of each of them, and then those monies being used for different purposes, including particularly, as we just discussed, the pure economic incentive. So people are, as developers are getting more sophisticated, they're using it, they're proposing it more, and as the cities get more sophisticated, you're starting to see them use all those tools more and more, and they're incentivized to go out and get the county to participate. So we're seeing more of that.
Great, great. And if somebody's thinking that they've got property in the ETJ, that they're having some challenges making the numbers work, they haven't thought about the PID, the TERS, the various combinations thereof, what should they do before they go start talking to the city? Here's a shameless plug for you, Tim.
Well, I was going to say it's not so much a plug for me, because they probably need to get a lawyer involved who is experienced in this area, and they need what I call a PID consultant or a PID TERS consultant like yourself, whose business is to understand all of these business economic tools and how they can be applied, and can go run the numbers and slice them and dice them and help the businessmen come up with what's the best business plan, and then educate the poor lawyer about it, and then the lawyer can help you go propose that to the city and work out those agreements. So it's really a team application, but there's got to be a lawyer and there's got to be a couple of business people back there running numbers.
And I agree with that, Tim. And it's been great working with you over the years on the PIDTIRs. And naturally, obviously, we would, to the extent that our clients or future clients would like to use us, this is what we do. Look at all the various different combinations. What kind of issues is the city facing, and what works out to be the best combination for the all parties involved, both the city, the county, and the developer, to move forward with putting in that infrastructure to help the city create the vision of the community they'd like to see. So, Tim, hey, we're nearing the end of our time. I really appreciate you taking the time again to explain the PID and the TIRs to our listeners. And once again, Tim Green is with Coates Rose. We will provide all of his contact information as part of the show notes. And Tim, is there anything else you'd like to conclude with?
No, I think this is a new industry. It's only been around about 10 or 12 years, this PID and PIDTIRs industry. It is something that is growing at a monumental and escalating rate. I think I understand there's going to be about $1 billion worth of PID or PIDTIRs bonds issued this year in Texas. That's starting from nothing 10 years ago. I think it is something that developers, if they don't know about it, need to learn about it now if they want to stay current. If they don't, then they're going to find themselves at a competitive disadvantage from their competitors. And again, it's something that they need to learn to stay competitive.
Great. Tim, thank you very much for taking the time today to speak with our listeners, and we look forward to future conversations.
You have been listening to the Land to Lots podcast with Carter Froelich. Tune in next week for the next episode.